The initial spark, how something trivial turned sinister. You think you know your neighbors. That's the lie we all tell ourselves, because believing otherwise is unsettling. It means admitting that the people living a few meters away, smiling over fences and exchanging small talk, might not be safe. Might not be neutral. Might not even see you as a person. I thought I knew mine. We weren't close, but we were polite. The kind of neighbors who wave, complain about the weather, and pretend everything is fine. No shared dinners. No arguments. Just peaceful coexistence. Until the garden gnome. I wish I were exaggerating. I wish this story started with something dramatic. But it didn't. It started with something so trivial, so absurd that I laughed when it first happened. One morning, while watering my plants, I noticed it had moved. My garden gnome, a small, ugly thing I'd owned for years, was no longer where I'd left it. It wasn't far. Just a few inches closer to the fence. Barely noticeable. I assumed the wind knocked it over. Or maybe I'd bumped it without realizing. I moved it back. The next day, it happened again. Same distance. Same angle. Same position, like someone had measured it. That's when I felt the first flicker of discomfort. Not fear. Not anger. Just awareness. Later that week, I noticed other things. Their lawn decorations had changed, subtly. A new sign appeared, angled toward my yard. Not offensive. Not explicit. Just pointed. Passive. Observant. At night they started doing chores. Not normal chores. Loud ones. Dragging tools across concrete at midnight. Hammering something that never seemed to get finished. Long conversations held directly by the fence, voices dropping when I stepped outside. It felt intentional, but just plausible enough to deny. I told myself I was overthinking it. Until the first direct interaction. I approached them calmly. Smiling. Light-hearted. "Hey, weird question. Have you been moving the gnome?" They laughed. Not awkwardly. Not nervously. Perfectly. "Oh no," one of them said. "Why would we do that?" The other added. "Maybe you're just forgetting where you put it." That sentence stuck with me. Not because it was rude, but because it planted doubt. I went home feeling unsettled, like I'd embarrassed myself. Like I'd imagined the whole thing. But the behavior didn't stop. The gnome moved again. The signs multiplied. The noise intensified. Each time, the actions were small enough to seem harmless, but consistent enough to form a pattern. And patterns are never accidents. I began noticing how they watched me. Not openly. Not obviously. Reflections in windows. Pauses in conversation when I appeared. A stillness that felt deliberate. The moment I truly understood this wasn't coincidence came during a neighborhood gathering. Barbecue. Laughter. Plastic cups. Casual conversation. One of them raised a toast, jokingly, about respecting boundaries. Everyone laughed. Everyone except me. Because as their eyes met mine, the smile didn't reach them. That was the moment the truth settled in. This wasn't about a gnome. This wasn't about property lines. This was about control. And they had decided, together, that I was the easiest target. At the time, I still believed it would blow over. That adults don't behave this way for long. That logic eventually prevails. I was wrong. What started as something laughable was only the opening move. And I hadn't even seen the board yet. At first, I kept telling myself one thing. If I don't react, it will stop. That's what we're taught, right? Ignore bullies. Be the bigger person. Don't feed bad behavior. The problem is, that advice only works when the other side wants attention. My neighbors didn't. They wanted control. When normal life turns tactical. I didn't notice it all at once. It crept in slowly, disguised as inconvenience. I started changing how I left my house. Not consciously at first, just small adjustments. I'd wait an extra minute before stepping outside. I'd check the window before opening the door. I'd listen. Because somehow, every time I went into my yard, they were already there. Not always doing anything. Just present. Sometimes talking loudly. Sometimes suddenly silent. Once, I stepped out to take the trash, and one of them leaned casually against the fence and said, "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" The tone wasn't friendly. It wasn't hostile either. It was measured. As if they were testing how close they could get without crossing a line. That was when I realized. They weren't reacting to me anymore. They were anticipating me. The fence became a border. The fence between our properties used to be just that, a fence. Then it became a line. Then a boundary. Then a front line. They started attaching things to it. Decorations. Hooks. Lights. Always on their side, but angled toward mine. Nothing illegal. Nothing that could be reported. But enough to make it feel like my space was shrinking. I measured it once. The distance between their items and my yard had decreased by inches. Again, deliberate. When I adjusted my plants to reclaim space, the next day something new appeared on the fence. A motion sensor light. Pointed directly at my bedroom window. It turned on every time I moved at night. Sleep became difficult. Not because of the light, but because of the message. "We see you." Seeking help, and being dismissed. Eventually, I did what any rational person would do. I documented everything. Dates. Times. Photos. Videos. I contacted local authorities, not to escalate, but to ask for guidance. The response? Polite indifference. "This sounds like a civil matter. Have you tried talking to them? Unfortunately, this doesn't meet the threshold for harassment." I remember standing there, folder in hand, feeling ridiculous. Because how do you explain intent when the actions are small? How do you prove malice when everything is technically allowed? I left that office feeling more exposed than before. Because now I knew something worse. They could do this indefinitely. And no one would stop them. The psychological toll no one warns you about. The anxiety didn't come as panic attacks. It came as vigilance. I started scanning for patterns everywhere. Was that noise intentional? Did they move something again? Was that coincidence, or timing? My home, the place meant to be safe, became a chessboard. Every task required planning. When to water plants. When to leave the house. When to open a window. I stopped inviting friends over. Not because I was embarrassed, but because I didn't want them involved. Didn't want them watched. Didn't want them uncomfortable. Isolation happened quietly. And that's the part no one talks about. Not the fear, but the shrinkage of your world. Escalation without contact. What made it worse was the absence of direct confrontation. They never yelled. Never threatened. Never accused. They didn't need to. They escalated through environment. Noise at strategic times. Objects placed just close enough. Lights. Sounds. Presence. Once I overheard laughter, followed by, "Let's see how long this lasts." They didn't say my name. They didn't have to. Evidence becomes a shield. I began wearing headphones, not for music, but to record. I installed cameras, not to spy, but to protect myself. I changed routines, not because I wanted to, but because unpredictability became survival. I learned something unsettling. When someone wants to intimidate you quietly, they don't want your reaction. They want your adaptation. Because adaptation is submission. The absurdity of it all. What haunted me most was how ridiculous it all was. This wasn't a crime drama. This wasn't a land dispute. This wasn't revenge for some great injustice. It started with a garden gnome. And yet, here I was, mapping my own movements like a soldier in hostile territory. That contrast, the absurd origin and the very real impact, made it harder to explain to others. People would laugh. Over a gnome? Just ignore them. Move it back. They didn't understand. This wasn't about the object. It was about what moving it represented. The moment I knew this was intentional. One night, very late, I stepped outside unexpectedly. No planning. No checking. Just impulse. The noise stopped instantly. Lights went off. Silence fell like a curtain. That's when it clicked. Randomness breaks scripts. And they had one. They weren't reacting emotionally. They were following a plan. And that meant one thing. This wasn't going to stop on its own. There's a moment in prolonged conflict that no one warns you about. Not the fear. Not the anger. Not even the exhaustion. It's the moment when you stop asking why. Because once you stop asking why someone is hurting you, you stop hoping they'll stop on their own. And that's when everything changes. When you realize you're not dealing with reason. For a long time, I believed there must be some explanation I was missing. A misunderstanding. A buried resentment. A perceived slight I could apologize for. Something rational. But as the weeks turned into months, one thing became clear. They weren't confused. They weren't offended. They weren't even emotional. They were engaged. This was entertainment. Control. Routine. And the most disturbing part. They adjusted faster than I did. Every time I adapted, they countered. If I changed my schedule, theirs shifted too. If I avoided certain spaces, those became their favorite spots. If I stopped reacting, the behavior didn't disappear, it refined itself. That's when I understood. They weren't trying to scare me away. They were trying to reshape me. The cost of constant awareness. Living under constant observation does something strange to your mind. You don't feel panic, you feel management. Your thoughts become logistical. Where can I stand without being seen? How long before the light turns on? If I open the window now, will it trigger noise later? I wasn't living. I was navigating. I stopped trusting coincidence entirely. A door slam wasn't a door slam. Laughter wasn't laughter. Silence wasn't peace. Everything felt intentional. And that kind of hyper-awareness erodes you quietly. Friends would ask how I was doing. I'd say, I'm fine. Because explaining it sounded insane. Because there were no bruises. No threats. No recordings that screamed crime. Just atmosphere. An atmosphere is impossible to prosecute. The breaking point that didn't look like one. People assume a breaking point is dramatic. A scream. A confrontation. A call to the police. Mine was none of that. Mine was a Tuesday. Nothing unusual happened that day. No noise. No lights. No presence. And that was worse. Because I realized something terrifying. They didn't need to do anything anymore. I was already altered. I was already cautious. Already isolated. Already silent. They had achieved what they wanted. And that realization broke something inside me, not loudly, but cleanly. I stopped being afraid. Not because I felt safe. But because fear had finished its job. Choosing a different kind of power. That night, I sat alone and made a decision. Not to fight them. Not to expose them. Not to win. I decided to stop being interesting. People like this feed on engagement, even passive engagement. My discomfort had become part of their system. So I removed it. I stopped adjusting my behavior for them. Not defensively. Deliberately. I returned to my routines, inconsistently. Sometimes early. Sometimes late. Sometimes not at all. I reclaimed unpredictability. And something subtle shifted. The first signs of cracks. At first, nothing changed. Then, delays appeared. The noise wasn't immediate. The lights didn't always turn on. The presence became hesitant. As if they were waiting for a cue that never came. One afternoon, I stood in my yard longer than usual. No reaction. Another day, I moved something near the fence. Nothing. And that's when I noticed it. They had been relying on my responses more than I realized. Without feedback, their system stalled. When control loses its grip. Weeks passed. Their behavior didn't escalate. It decayed. Not dramatically, awkwardly. Attempts felt mistimed. Gestures felt forced. Moments missed their target. Once, a noise came hours late. Another time, a light flicked on, then off, then never again. They were guessing now. And guesswork isn't power. The quiet collapse. I never confronted them. Never accused. Never won publicly. But something unmistakable happened. They stopped. Not all at once. But enough. Enough that my body noticed before my mind did. I slept through the night. I stopped scanning windows. I invited someone over without thinking twice. The house felt normal. And that's when it hit me. This was the first time in months my life wasn't organized around someone else's intentions. The aftermath no one sees. Even when it ended, it didn't end cleanly. There was residue. I still startled easily. Still listened too closely. Still doubted peace. But slowly, those instincts softened. And I understood something important. Surviving psychological intimidation isn't about strength. It's about refusing participation. People who seek control don't fear confrontation. They fear irrelevance. What I learned the hard way. Here's the truth I wish someone had told me earlier. Not every conflict can be resolved. Not every situation has closure. Not every villain gets exposed. Sometimes the only victory is withdrawal without retreat. Staying. Living. Unchanged in essence. And letting the other side starve on silence. Why I'm telling this now? I'm sharing this story because I know someone reading this recognizes the feeling. The sense that something is off, but not provable. The exhaustion of explaining why. It's not nothing. The shame of feeling affected by something so small. If that's you, you're not weak. You're not imagining it. And you're not obligated to play along. Sometimes the most radical move is simply to stop being a mirror. Final thought. My neighbors didn't defeat me. They didn't outsmart me. They didn't win. They just faded. And I reclaimed something far more valuable than revenge. I reclaimed myself.